This week on Make Better Wealth Decisions, we're speaking with Michael Scarpati, who is an executive from the United States dealing with helping people to retire by thinking about everything that goes into retirement planning and the assumptions people use, the expectations they have, and whether or not those are realistic and whether the expectations are overly optimistic and, in fact, take into account all the various contingencies of government entitlements and longevity in healthcare. It's a fascinating discussion. Don't miss it.
Make Better Wealth Decisions, a podcast that explores how financial advisors' blind spots can harm your investments. I'm your host, John DeGuy, a portfolio manager with Design Securities in Toronto. In this podcast, we'll provide advice on how you can achieve better outcomes by maximizing investments and minimizing taxes. Let's put our thinking caps on as we consciously decide to get smarter about our money.
This week on Make Better Wealth Decisions, we're speaking to Michael Scarpati. He is the co-founder and CEO of Retire US, a financial wellness platform dedicated to empowering individuals to achieve financial mastery. After spending a decade as an independent financial professional, designing financial systems for high net worth individuals and corporate executives, Michael shifted his focus to democratizing financial advice. In 2022, he co-founded Retire US with the mission to make independent expert guidance accessible to all and ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to achieve financial freedom. Those sound like great, noble objectives. Michael, welcome. And maybe you could tell us just a little bit about your journey and how you got to where you are right now.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you, John, for having me on the podcast here. And I'm excited to dive into some of these concepts with you. The journey was long and grueling, as many financial professionals probably have experienced, but it was really rewarding because it came through that independent track. And there's a big perspective change, I think, for a lot of professionals once they see the difference between institutional advisory advice and some of the just ways that there's specific focuses in their scope and constraints and how they can give advice and that independent perspective and how wide and deep you can go with a plan and strategy for clients. It's almost 15 years in the business at this point, and that's been rewarding, but it's also been really insightful and personally empowering.
We're here in Canada and we have the same challenges, and talking about saving for retirement is one of the evergreen topics that never seems to go away.
Yep.
What would your impression be? Do you think people are generally speaking saving enough? And if so, why and how? And if not, what should they be doing differently? What are your thoughts on retirement preparation?
Yeah. It's challenging for people. The reality is, if you look at the data, most Americans are behind. Most Americans don't know how much they need to have saved in order to effectively retire. And most people have in the 80 to 120,000 median range of retirement savings, when most data says you're going to need 1.2 to 1.4 million in the state to just effectively step away from work. So the American public's behind. I'm curious if you see the same thing do you see the same thing in Canada? You feel it's the same way?
The answer is absolutely yes. It's that, which is what I say. It's an evergreen problem. And I don't think it's even unique to North America. If you go to Belgium, if you go to Australia, if you go to Japan, I think the problem is recognized and widely accepted throughout the Western world, and frankly, even more dire in the less developed world, right? So it's one of those things where everyone knows, like eating a healthy diet, everyone knows they should be doing it, but not everyone actually does it. So it's a challenge. One of the things that we talked about before we began taping is this notion of a lost decade. And that is something that I personally think is a very real threat for investors in general. And since you're an American, for American investors in particular, given where we are with regard to valuations. What are your thoughts on the possibility of a lost decade going forward?
Yeah. So to fill the viewers in, if you're not familiar, the lost decade is in the year 2000, 2010, essentially the markets went up, they crashed, they went back up, they crashed, and you ended right where you started. So it's a 10 years of investing where you're planning as an investor, someone's planning for retirement, that you're going to get 10 years of compounded growth. The reality was it was pretty much right where you started 10 years later. So it's known as the lost decade, and it's really two massive market crashes, the tech bubble bursting, the housing crisis in 2008. And the topic started to come back, for us at least, the way that we see things, because of how this bull run has been happening. There's been some choppiness. COVID had a little bit of a dip, but the reality is markets have been strong for more than a decade. We've had a decade of growth, and investors, from my experience, tend to have very short-term memory spans when it comes to the pain of the market crash. And it's important for everybody, I think, to take a step back and really look at all of the moving pieces here and ask ourselves why. I think intuitively, most investors feel like things don't add up when you look at stock market valuations, but then you also look at right now quality of life, inflation, and wages not increasing at the same rate as inflation, just the economic turmoil people are experiencing across the globe, international conflicts. There's a lot of different moving pieces. Add in the interest rate volatility that we've seen the past couple of years, and now things starting to change there. The signs are there. I think people feel it in their inner being that something doesn't smell right based off all those moving pieces. I think it's likely we're going to see a rough couple of years at some point. And I don't think it's a matter of if. I personally think it's a matter of when we're going to see something. What are your thoughts on it?
So my thoughts are the exact same, which is why I was so eager to have you on, because I feel oftentimes that I'm whistling past the graveyard when I express the same concerns that you've expressed. Let me give you a couple of examples that I like to use to really drive the point home. People in North America tend to take their frame of reference from North American data sets. But in Japan, in 1989, the Nikkei 225 hit an all-time high on the last day of the year on December 31st of 1989, and it did not regain that level until I think it was earlier this year. Maybe it was in 2023, but maybe I think it was 2024. Basically, we're not talking about a lost decade. We're talking about a lost 1/3 of a century.
Wow.
And so if you're 55 years old in Kyoto and thinking you're going to retire soon, and it's the end of 1989, and you've got the bulk of your life savings in the Japanese stock market, as most people do because home country is a bias everywhere, then chances are you either died waiting for the market to come back because you'd be, if you made it to 88, or if you lived to be 88, yay, you made it to see the market come back to where you were in 1989, but you're now 88 years old. And every year that you've been retired, you've been forced to withdraw money from a pool of capital that was lower than it was before you retired. And that, of course, makes it difficult. Getting back to where you started, it assumes no contributions or withdrawals in the interim. But we all know that people have to retire. And even if it hits a peak at 55, and even if you can contribute for the next 10 years, that's still more than 20 years after that you're taking money out. And chances are you're not going to have even as much money as you thought you had at the end of the third of a century. So that's one example. Yep. I'll give you another. And I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Robert Shiller, but Shiller won a Nobel in 2013, and he wrote a book called Irrational Exuberance and co-wrote Fishing for Fools, and wrote a few other books, Narrative Economics. But he's best known for his work on the cyclically adjusted price earnings ratio. So he basically called the housing bubble when it crashed in 08, 09. And he was one of the people that was actually in giving testimony to Governor Greenspan, was pointing out this problem. And Greenspan actually borrowed the phrase from Shiller. But Shiller does work with regard to the stock market as well. And if you control for inflation and take a 10-year smoothing out average, the price earnings ratio on the S&P 500 right now is at around 38, and that puts it in about the 98th percentile. Markets have been more expensive, but only by a bit and only for very short periods. We are basically at the most expensive stock market we've seen since the dot-com bubble, and probably the second most expensive ever. To put it in perspective, when the bubble burst in 1929, the CAPE ratio for the S&P 500 was around 31. We're at 38 now. Like, we're a full 25% higher, more expensive, more risky than we were when the market began the Great Depression. What would you recommend to people who are planning their retirement? And in particular, what would you recommend to people who are retired, given that that's the circumstances we find ourselves in late 2024?
First of all, that's incredible data that you just pulled out there. And it paints a really great picture of where things are currently. I think to piggyback onto that, one of the things I don't think a lot of people are taking into consideration is the fact that all of the money that's been printed in the States and the government spending, the way that drives up stock market is something that I don't think a lot of people are fully taking into account. And when you have trillions and trillions of dollars that are being printed over a handful of years, 4 or 5 years, that money is going somewhere. It's getting pumped back into the system. And so, one, it's just not sustainable. Take a look at the US deficit. We're already past point of no return. So a lot of restructuring needs to happen regardless. But the amount of spending that is artificial that's happened in these past 5 years is one of the major keys that I think the investing public, again, the people like to think that markets only go up.
Right. So I'll give you some examples, Michael, just to fill in some blanks, to put some numbers, because that's just what I do. This week, the U.S. federal accumulated debt hit $36 trillion.
Yep.
That's an astonishing number, $36 trillion. And it is going up. So talking about deficits, which is the debt is just the accumulation of all the deficits laid end to end. The deficit goes up by about $1 trillion every 100 days. Yeah. So here we are in the second half of November, and the debt is $36 trillion. And quite literally, by the time we get to, say, Valentine's Day or the 1st of March, it's not a stretch that it would be $37 trillion. It's just going up that quickly. And with interest rates as high as they are, to try to keep inflation under control, the cost of carry becomes onerous to the point where there's just no way we really have any reasonable chance of ever paying it all back.
Yeah. The fact of the matter is the U.S. debt is $36 trillion. And now the interest payments have hit the exponential curve component of unstoppable deficit growth. So there's a big issue here, right? And that's just one of many factors right now that are going to ultimately impact what happens in the stock market. And so I think, to go back to your previous question, it's just making key decisions around where you are right now in relation to where you need to be. And what I mean by that is taking the step to really truly quantify your cost of living, whether if you're retired now, what do you need, right? But what do you actually need to have saved? And taking a look at, where are you in relation to that? Do you even need to be taking risk right now? I think is just a big key thing, that a lot of people are taking risk just for the sake of it, and they don't necessarily need to. Interest rates are still high. You can still get high yield return that keeps pace with inflation, at least now, without taking any market risk. And so I think it's just key for people to take a look at the reality of what they need versus maybe what they want or what they feel like has served them well in the past. I would advise that it probably doesn't necessarily serve you moving forward, and just taking a step back to evaluate that. And the same goes for the pre-retirees. If you're not yet retired, it is so vitally important for you to understand, what do you actually need? What is the end goal, and what is the target rate of return? Because odds are, we see it all the time, odds are you can actually be taking substantially less risk. And because you're just allocated the way you were 5 years or 10 years ago, you're so far out of alignment with the level of risk that you should be taking or need to be taking. There's so much money we can take off the gambling table at the moment. And there's a lot of avenues that can give us great return that don't have to participate in a lot of the market risks that we are traditionally used to. So that would be my advice, is quantify where we actually need to be in relation to where we are, and then reassess if any level of risk makes sense for the next couple of years as some of the stuff sorts itself out.
Again, I agree. I think I should probably begin by saying that is something that I have harped on a lot, and therefore I'm not going to say it again here because it's been said before and you've been quite eloquent about it. Put the expectation versus the reality of saving for retirement. It's been said that if you are missing your retirement goals, you think you're going to fall short, you've basically got 4 options. You can save more, you can invest more aggressively, you can retire later, or you can consign yourself to a lesser quality of life when you finally do retire. And those are your 4 main variables. So we've been talking a little bit about the risk people take. What about savings rates? Do you find that when you talk to people and say, you really need to save an extra $300 a month, that's really just $10 a day. Surely you can find $10 a day. Isn't that right, Mr. Jones? How does Mr. Jones feel about that when you tell him that?
The reality is right now, the numbers don't lie. If we can save more, even if it's incrementally more each month, day, year, it's going to be impactful. Time is really the biggest asset. So for the younger listeners out there, at least doing something, starting somewhere is so key. But the reality is it's tough right now. Inflation has really hurt people over the past couple of years. I don't know how, I'd love to hear actually how it's been in Canada, but in the States, there was a couple of years of really rough inflation. And the constant narrative that you hear is, well, inflation's down now. But the piece that people aren't explaining to the public is that the damage is done. We're just talking about the rate in which things are continuing to grow, right? Things have already grown at a rate that makes the cost of living challenging for people to have additional discretionary income to save. And that's one of the big things that we're finding is we need deflation is the reality, or we need wages to dramatically increase over the next couple of years. Otherwise, the public's going to just continue to fall behind. It's just a matter of falling behind now at a slower rate than they were before.
So one of the things that I think, and I don't have a crystal ball, but there's a fairly strong consensus that the incoming president will be more inflationary than people think because of the mass deportations and the 10% tariffs across the board. That may or may not come to pass. We'll see. Other things need to happen. It's too early to say for sure, but it would be ironic if Americans were upset with the inflation they had to endure over the past 4 years and then throw out the person that they believe is most responsible for that, only to replace that person with someone who might even be more inflationary going forward. But people tend to be backward looking when they go to the ballot box, and all they think about is how they felt in the past little while, and they feel good. They just assume the alternative must be better. And maybe it will be, and maybe it won't be. But it's funny how people always do things looking in the rearview mirror and assume that the future will resemble the recent past, which is seldom the case. It's something we call recency bias. And a lot of what we're talking about in investing is just assuming that what you've experienced in the past little while is what you're going to experience for the foreseeable future. You've got an initiative that you've been working on for a while. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the Retire Ready initiative is something that we're really focused on right now. So Retire US's entire mission is to give everybody access to independent experts, to give everyone the opportunity to achieve financial freedom. And what we found in some of the things that we spoke to a little bit earlier is that the investing public, particularly in that 55 plus range, are falling behind currently. The data tells us that is the case. And we're looking to give everybody an opportunity to get some guidance on what they need to ultimately have saved to retire, how much they should be saving, how to invest that money, and give them a plan and a path forward to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And so Retire Ready is available. It gives everybody access to any subscription on the Retire US platform for a $250 discount for year one. So very steep, close to 50% on some of the subscription types. And that gets you access to 3 live meetings with an independent professional, full quantification of retirement, cash flow tracking and planning, and really hoping to give everybody a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to retirement.
Funny. One of the things I note, I was at the Future Proof conference in Huntington Beach, California about a month ago. And one of the things that I noticed is that the Americans tend to be pretty far ahead of Canadians with regard to financial technology, fintech, and the use of AI and the incorporation of AI. My podcast guest just last week, we talked about AI. And it's always fascinating when I speak to people south of the border, learning what they're doing, because it's like we get to see the future, because what's going on in the US is going to come to Canada eventually, but services such as those that you provide are not available in Canada at any price under any circumstances. So it's interesting. Tell me a little bit about retirement preparedness. Most people don't really have a sense. 4 out of 5 people don't even know what retirement is going to cost. What are your thoughts on retirement preparedness and retirement projections and thinking about healthcare costs and longevity and those sorts of things?
I think it's going to be I think it's gonna be a rocky road ahead. At least, in the States, Social Security is also in a pretty bad space. Reserves were set to run out by 2030 unless there's some dramatic changes. We're coming up on that in 6 years here, and there has not been anything to ultimately shift how Social Security is being funded. You also have the baby boomers are really in that phase right now of retirement. So a ton of people are about to turn on Social Security, and Social Security reserves are the lowest they've ever been. And it's creating this need for privatization of your own retirement plan. You have to be prepared, in my opinion, at least at the moment, to own your full retirement picture, because the math behind the government support isn't quite adding up at the moment. So I think that the numbers tell us people are unprepared. What I would say to help people get more prepared is starting to quantify what life is really going to cost you, your needs versus your wants, two totally different things when we're planning for the future. But we can use the now to forecast out what at least our basic living expenses are going to look like, whether that's 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. It's just a matter of how you can reverse engineer that data, reverse engineer that information to see what you ultimately need. I think you said the stat was 4 out of 5 people don't know what their retirement needs are. And that comes on two sides, right? It's needs in terms of just actual pure income. What does, taking into account inflation, taking into account healthcare, what is your future income need? And then taking that a step further, which is what's your nest egg need? What do you actually need to have saved in order to recreate that income indefinitely for your entire retirement?
The one thing that I would say that I don't want to mislead the people listening that are Canadians. Actually, in Canada, the story is rather different. So the Canada Pension Plan is on extremely solid footing, and it's set to be well funded for at least the next 65 or 70 years. And in fact, it's been expanded so that when it was originally created, the design was to replicate 1/4 of your income when you were working up to a certain amount. As it's being expanded in the future years, it will be at the point where it pays 1/3 of your previous income. That's going to take another 10 or 12 years to get to that point, but the contribution rates have been adjusted in order for the payout rates to be adjusted accordingly over time as well. All right, let's see if we can wrap this up. Michael, this has been a really fascinating conversation, but I always like to end with my favorite question is, if it was up to you, what advice would you give to help people make better wealth decisions?
My advice would be to take a step back. I think we're always in it, right? We're always in it and we're never working on it is a big trend that is just the reality of life. Life is busy and we're constantly trying to just see 6 feet, 10 feet in front of us. And a lot of times it takes a ton of effort to pull yourself out from being fully in life and being able to work on your life when it comes to the financial side of things. And so my advice would be seek counsel. I think that's the biggest thing that holds people accountable to actually do the work financially. We know it's not fun stuff. Even the people that are in the business know it can be just painstaking to go through the data. There's solutions out there. Retire US is one of them, to leverage technology to make the process very easy, at least to get started, and then connect you with somebody that can actually hold the process accountable and just force you to take a hard look at things. Because the reality is, if we don't take a look at it, we're never going to know. We're always going to feel uncomfortable, and clarity is not going to be something that is readily available for us. So being able to separate yourself from the day-to-day just for an hour or two to work on the financials rather than just constantly living in them, I think is the best way to make better wealth decisions.
Michael, that's been really insightful. And I really want to thank you for your time today. It's been a pleasure. All the best of luck to you in the future.
John, thank you so much, man. Great time.
John DeGooey is a portfolio manager with Design Securities in Toronto. The views expressed in this program are not to be construed as specific advice. It is recommended that you consult a qualified advisor before taking action. His books, The Professional Financial Advisor 4, Stand Up to the Financial Services Industry, and Bullshift are available through Amazon and in bookstores throughout Canada. You can reach John at 647-STAND-UP. That's 647-782-6387, or at jdegooey@designedsecurities.ca.